more so than most forms of media, anime suffers from villains that appear to come out of nowhere, especially in Shonen Jump, which makes sense. Most shonen anime and manga follow an arc-based structure, whereby one villain replaces the last, until being replaced again in the following arc, and again, and again, and so on. What I'm getting at is, since shonen anime are A, often incredibly long, reaching multiple hundreds of episodes, and B, typically follow this arc-based structure, where villains are replaced on a whim and typically don't stay around for too long, this makes it all the more impressive when you have a good overarching villain, an antagonist that's not only engaging and interesting, but one that can stand the test of time, potentially staying relevant for hundreds and hundreds of episodes. And that is no more evident than our main trio of Gintama antagonists, Kamui, Utsuro, and Takasugi, who today I've decided to look at from a more holistic standpoint, as opposed to one by one in individual videos, since they all share common attributes that make them all so fantastic. So with that being said, let's begin straight away with one of the main points that makes these characters work so well: build up. What I mean by that is just how far in advance they are introduced, or foreshadowed in Utsuro's case, before their most climactic scenes. Takasugi is easily the best example, showing up in episode 17 but continuing to lurk in the shadows for the next 300 or so episodes. His role within the narrative is incredibly subtle but effective, acting as the master puppeteer behind the scenes, giving him an ominous, unnerving quality that continues to add to his already mysterious character, since much like Gintoki, we know virtually nothing about his background until significantly later. For the first couple hundred episodes, he does seem untouchable, always in a location isolated from our protagonists, whether it be showing up once the action is already over, manipulating the action from behind the scenes, or simply showing up right at the end of an arc. He's never in the line of fire, never engaging in direct combat, which obviously foregrounds when he actually does, making it all the more satisfying, as a result of this masterful build-up, as a looming figure who only shows up at the tail end of important moments. Even from early on, it's clear as day his significance within Gintama, even in the way he's framed, both figuratively and literally looking down on others, instantly establishing him as the quote-unquote final boss from day one. And as good as this is, the main point of interest here is the sheer lengths to which it's achieved. Especially for a shonen anime, it's interesting to me just how infrequently the show's protagonist and antagonist actually meet. In the first 300 episodes, we see Gintoki and Takasugi together in episode 17, episode 61, and even then he doesn't actually talk to Gintoki, and to my knowledge, that's it. They share not one single scene again until their fight in Shogun Assassination, again re-establishing one of the best parts of his presence within the story, how subtle it is. The fact we have a villain that doesn't directly interact with the protagonist for a good 242 episodes, but still continues to be engaging and interesting, as we'll get onto later, speaks volumes, and I therefore think the sheer longevity of Takasugi's build-up cannot be emphasized enough. And to pull similarities from other anime, I think Johan from Monster is a similar story, only directly interacting with the protagonist on a few separate occasions, yet still remaining relevant behind the scenes as the master manipulator behind many key plot points. And much like Johan, this creates a sense of intrigue more so than any other Gintama character. Simply put, you want to know his backstory, you want to know how he was moulded into who he is, you want to see where his opposition to Gintoki stems from. And this enticement eventually pays off in the most satisfying way possible, as we effectively go from knowing nothing about him to pretty much all we could ask for in the blink of an eye, confirming or denying any preconceived expectations. But with the subtlety of Takasugi's role within the first couple hundred episodes of Gintama, we also have the complete opposite, with Kagura's antithesis instead Kamui, who takes a significantly more hands-on direct approach to his role as the antagonist. Much like Takasugi, it's commendable just how long Kamui remains important, first showing up during the Yoshiwara in Flames arc in episode 140, despite being foreshadowed for almost 100 episodes by this point, since episode 42, and remaining as a constant threat until his climactic fight in the Rakyu arc. But unlike Takasugi, Kamui's role as the antagonist is much less lurking in the shadows, and more taking the spotlight directly, Two characters who both serve as the antithesis for two of our protagonists, but are built up in significantly different ways. While Takasugi's gradual development creates a sense of intrigue and mystery surrounding his character, Kamui creates more a sense of dread, a nervous anticipation whenever he appears, essentially as a catalyst for violence within the story. The rationality of Takasugi and the irrationality of Kamui create an interesting dynamic. We have two characters who serve incredibly similar roles within the story, but are completely different in pretty much all other ways. As simple as it may be, it's always good when villains feel different. There's nothing worse in particularly shonen anime when you see villains with exactly zero personality that can be barely distinguished from other antagonists under the same generic archetype. And that's why I value how in Gintama there's a clear divide between our antagonist duo that stops them from blending into one, keeping them distinct and able to stand alone on an individual basis. For me, this is a big problem with a few long-running shonen, where villains simply don't feel distinct, and instead all just culminate into the antagonists, instead of specific characters outside of their roles as villains within the story. But anyway, back on the topic at hand, and when it comes to Kamui's build-up, it's a similar story to Takasugi. They both show up incredibly periodically, adding to their intrigue, and establishing themselves as the final challenge for Gintoki and Kagura respectively. In this sense, they both serve as a goal. As soon as we meet them, we instantly know that a duel between Gintoki and Takasugi, and one between Kamui and Kagura, is written in the stars. It will inevitably happen, creating a great sense of anticipation, which is essentially the bedrock of their importance within Gintama. They continually remain in the background, waiting to pounce from the shadows, and when they do, it pays off because of just how patient the writing of Gintama is. Constantly waiting for that perfect moment where the stars align, and all that build-up is released at once. Especially with Takasugi, considering he was introduced significantly earlier, and interacted with Gintoki a whole lot less than Kamui with Kagura. And again, I cannot stress enough how insane it is that, as far as I'm aware, episode 17 was the only time Takasugi directly talked to Gintoki until episode 304. If I'm missing something obvious, then please let me know. But with Takasugi and Kamui having the ridiculously long build-ups that they do, Utsuro, on the other hand, is another story. Utsuro's build-up consists far more of implications and guesswork, whereas with Takasugi and Gintoki, for instance, it was inevitable they would eventually meet again. Utsuro, on the other hand, is far more implied. We first meet Utsuro physically in episode 314, although Utsuro, or should I say Yoshida Shoujo, we first meet as early as episode 61, and then periodically after that in short flashbacks, such as during the Red Spider arc. It's obvious Yoshida Shoujo is important from early on. I mean, when a mentor figure's in anime, not important, but it's incredibly open-ended. Much like Takasugi, if I was Sorachi, I would simply not have the patience to keep Shoujo in the dark for as long as he did. Much like most Gintama characters, Shoujo undergoes what I like to call inverse character development. What I mean by this is, unlike normal shonen character development, where we grow alongside the protagonist, in Gintama it's much less linear. The amount we know about a given character is typically proportional to how long we've known about said character, giving more and more insight the further you go, as opposed to establishing a backstory right at the start, and then going from there like in most shonen. And Utsuro/Shoujo is a fine example. We start out with the faintest of hints and clues, an inkling towards his potential significance, but probably not a whole lot more, especially considering there's about a 100-episode gap between his first and second appearances. Next, by the time of Courtesan of a Nation, we get our first significant cluster of backstory, and then once again during the trio of climactic arcs, and then all the way until Gintama the Final, where at long last all is put to rest. Now, of course, one of the key moments of Shoujo's build-up is the Utsuro plot twist. When it's unveiled, they share the same body. A moment that lays the foundation of Gintama from then on, establishing a new definite antagonist in the place of Takasugi and Kamui. I always enjoy the split personality trope you occasionally see with antagonists, where it's not only a battle against the protagonist, but a battle against themselves. Especially in Utsuro's case, where it's further than a mere split personality, instead being two completely contrasting people occupying the same vessel, a physical manifestation of his acceptance of humanity and another for his rejection of humanity. Not only does this twist allow for Shoujo to continue being significant within the story, but also serves as a fantastic plot device to ensure he's not invincible. In early Gintama, Takasugi seems untouchable, on another level from anybody else. And Utsuro is a similar story. He feels invincible to some extent literally, but he's held back by Shoujo. His usual immortality is held back by Shoujo's mortality. And I say this because it's always annoying when you have these overpowered villains in anime, but the writer digs themselves into a hole. Because they've simply made them too strong, and no guardrails have been put in place to ensure the protagonist can eventually beat them in a somewhat believable fashion. And with that being said, let's move on to just that. Another point that makes Gintama's villains so amazing, believability. To have an effective villain in any capacity, they need to be believable. To have some form of human characteristics we can latch onto, recognise and understand. So often you get villains in anime who are evil for the sake of being evil, including some in Gintama itself. But it's always annoying when villains don't possess any human tendencies. Greed, vengeance, hatred, regret, whatever it may be that motivates a villain, it needs to be at least somewhat grounded in reality, even in a series as ridiculous as Gintama. And that's why I appreciate that even though 1.5 of our antagonists aren't really human, they still have recognisable and realistic motivations that don't make them feel too outlandish or plainly unnecessary. Takasugi is definitely the best example of this, and is the main reason he's, in my opinion, easily the best villain of the trio, which probably isn't a shock to anyone. I think the main point to be made is just how similar, yet different he is to Gintoki all at once. After the Joai War, both he and Gintoki share the same fate. They lose the person most important to them, and along with it, their entire sense of purpose. They're left with nothing but themselves in a world that they don't belong. They are both outcasts of mainstream society, struggling to adapt into the new world they find themselves in when all they'd known beforehand was Shokusonjuku, which no longer exists, and the battlefield, which again no longer exists. To put it lightly, their situation was bleak. How do you integrate into a society that rejects you? And for both Gintoki and Takasugi, Shoujo's death only served to fuel the pent-up hatred burning within them, eating away at their beings. However, this is where they diverge. Gintoki's despair is eliminated once being taken in by Otase, and eventually meeting Shinpachi, Kagura, etc., allowing him to have a new purpose for living. He is essentially reborn and allowed to forget about the past. Whereas for Takasugi, he's not so lucky. Takasugi's hatred is unyielding, and unlike Gintoki, he's never able to forget or at least suppress the past. He's never reborn as a new person, and instead continues to vent his hatred into the world that's been so painful to him. And in this regard, I'd argue that if Gintoki had never met Otase on that day in the graveyard, never starting Yorozora and never adapting to a new way of life, he would have ended up just like Takasugi, unable to escape the past, shackled by his own hatred and discontent. And this is what's so believable about Takasugi. His entire life is essentially stripped away from him, as he recognises the golden days at Shokusonjuku are gone, and he'll never be able to rekindle those long-forgotten bonds and emotions like Gintoki obtains with Yorozora. And with that, all he can do is vent his anger, scream into the abyss and hope for a response. Ultimately, Takasugi's character is nothing if not tragic. His calm and composed demeanour is a facade to hide the unyielding hatred that controls him. And this is no more evident than during his fights with Gintoki, as we'll get onto shortly. His calm and composed attitude is shattered, and he unleashes his pure, unadulterated hatred all at once, an outburst of raw emotion moving him forwards. And then afterwards, Takasugi realises the futility of his actions. This whole time, his hatred had no basis, as Gintoki reminds him, no matter how loud he screams, Shoujo is dead and it's time to let go of the past. Gintoki was reborn after being taken in by Otase, and I believe this moment is where Takasugi was reborn. After this, he's a new man, essentially a protagonist or anti-hero type figure from that point onwards, upon gaining a deeper understanding for Gintoki and also himself. He can live without the aforementioned shackles of hatred holding him back. And by the time of Gintama the Final, Takasugi is a completely different person from the start of Gintama, concluding one of the most interesting but also believable villains in all of anime. There's not one single action he does that cannot be explained in a logical, justified way. But now, moving on to antagonist number 2, and we have Kamui, who's a lot more simplistic as a whole, but still incredibly concise and believable. To me, he's essentially the equivalent of a misguided, naive child stumbling into gang violence, but replace the gang in question with the Harusame. Kamui's early life is plagued by tragedy. His mother died when he was young, he was bullied and ostracized for being a member of the Yato, and he was almost killed by his own father. Unlike Takasugi, who had certainly not a perfect but much more stable childhood, Kamui could not have grown up in a worse environment, joining the Harusame at around age 10, if not younger, and practically surrounded by violence all his life. Which, unsurprisingly, leads to his irrationality, fighting purely on instinct and his own prideful values as a member of the Yato tribe. He doesn't reason and instead lets his actions do the talking, since that's all he's ever known. In his warped childhood, violence appeared to always be the answer, so he upholds that all the way from start to finish. When we talk about nature versus nurture, this is pretty much the worst of both worlds. By his nature, the Yato tribe are infamously violent to begin with, and by nurture, he grew up in an environment which facilitated violence. Considering the Yato are already prone to violent outbursts, to have a twisted childhood like he did is adding fuel to the fire, transforming him into the monster we see later in the series. Both Kamui and Takasugi lose all that they care about and isolate themselves from their former friends and family, instead acting on their own accord, but the key difference that at least shapes their personalities were their childhoods. Whereas Takasugi gained friends, comrades, a mentor, even a slight formal education, Kamui only had Kagura as his sole comfort, the only thing he cared about, even if he was unwilling to admit it, and even then he had to abandon her. Ultimately, Kamui's love for fighting makes complete sense. Violence is literally his nature embedded within Yato code, but most importantly, if violence is all he's ever known, then a path of violence he shall follow. It's as simple as that. But then we get to Utsuro, who again shares similar difficulties to Kamui and Takasugi: loss, abandonment, isolation, rejection, etc., but amplified on a much higher level, shaping him into the twisted antagonist we see him as. So far we've been talking about isolation and abandonment, but this is more evident in Utsuro than anyone else. Ostracized and shunned by the rest of humanity out of fear for his immortality, leading him to almost losing his own humanity as a whole. The sheer level in which he was rejected is absurd, almost completely unbelievable. Tortured, shunned, killed time and time again, but saved by his immortality, suffering decades locked away in a cell, abandoned until the wooden door literally rotted off its hinges. It's almost comical just how extreme Utsuro's exclusion was, when spending literal decades without so much as a single human interaction, only left with the thoughts in his head. It was inevitable he'd develop some form of split personality, just as a slight coping mechanism for his immense loneliness. It's hard to even imagine what that level of isolation would do to a person, and therefore, Utsuro's hatred of humanity is pretty justified to say the absolute least. However, over time, we start to see a shift in his perspective on life. Beginning with his meeting and eventual mentorship over Oboro, we see his new persona, Yoshida Shoyo, an embodiment of his acceptance of humanity. This dichotomy between Shoyo and Utsuro makes for an interesting concept where no matter which persona he puts on, he's always at odds with his alter ego. No matter how far his newfound faith in humanity takes him, he cannot forgive his past treatment. Just like Takasugi, Utsuro is plagued by his past, but on a significantly greater scale. Although Takasugi's suffering is certainly more fathomable, more believable in the context of the real world, swearing vengeance upon the death of a parent figure, Utsuro as a villain is believable because at the heart of it, his backstory is incredibly simple, only on an almost over-the-top scale. He is an extreme example of what rejection and neglect can do to a person, transforming an individual from a human to a monster. In this case literally, but also metaphorically. He's so disattached from humanity, he can only contain it within a completely different personality, who may as well be a completely different person. But anyway, now that we've firmly established how fantastic our trio of villains are in Gintama, let's analyse another component of a good villain, their lasting impact with both the story and with the audience. It doesn't matter how well written a villain may be, if they don't have a strong impact within the narrative itself, then what's the point? A good villain creates profound impacts on those they interact with, as well as with the viewers. And once again, starting with Takasugi, do I even need to get into his impactfulness in Gintama? The fight between him and Gintoki in Shogun Assassination is one of the greatest of all time, putting to rest a few hundred episodes of build-up. Here we learn all that we'd questioned so far, where his hatred stemmed from, why a lot of it was directed at Gintoki, and even how they split apart in the first place. And in this regard, the main impact this fight leaves us is satisfaction. It concludes Takasugi's story arc and his role as Gintama's central antagonist. And speaking of which, some may disagree, but I'm glad Takasugi's transition from antagonist to protagonist feels much more natural than the Naruto-esque talk no jutsu you often see with some other Gintama villains. He still has blood-stained hands, and he works to clean them off as a form of redemption, culminating in his sacrifice during Gintama the Final, ending off one of, if not the greatest antagonists in all of Shonen. In those final moments, his interactions with Gintoki are heartbreaking, presenting him as more human than ever before, as the deep parallels between Gintoki and Takasugi are most evident. They both lost all that they had, but one found resolve and one did not. With Kamui, on the other hand, I would admit the jump from a bloodthirsty psychopath to just a regular guy was a little unnatural and out of nowhere, especially considering there's no real redemption arc like Takasugi gets. But even still, Kamui is, in my opinion, a spectacular villain. Not on the same league as Takasugi and Utsuro, considering he is quite simple in his backstory and motivations. However, it's better to be simple but effective than creating an overly complex villain that ends up falling flat. Takasugi and Kamui go hand in hand, contrasting personalities who share similar roles within the story, and both get progressively more interesting and also likeable as the series moves forwards. When first introduced, Takasugi is nothing but a stereotypical edgelord with no personality, and Kamui is nothing but a brainless maniac, but as the story continues, their respective backstories and further actions shift our perspective on them as characters, moulding them into the fantastic villains they are later on in the series, especially in the way they influence or are influenced by Gintoki and Kagura respectively. Gintoki and Takasugi's hatred for each other is masked in a veil of mutual respect, and again, this is most evident in Gintama the Final. Their respect for each other is clear, and shows that despite bearing alternate paths in life, they are always united by their past, united under a common childhood and role on the battlefield. And I think the key takeaway for Takasugi is what could have been. Unlike Gintoki, he was never able to let go of the past, and therefore never content, never happy with a world that took so much from him, yet gave him so little. And then, when Utsuro first shows up, we finally have that unifying bond between Gintoki and Takasugi appear physically. Their sense of unity is reawakened, and they both have a goal to fulfill, instead of aimlessly wandering like before. But anyway now, let's conclude. Kamui, Utsuro, and Takasugi all have common traits that make them out to be fantastic villains. Firstly, their longevity, gradually built up or foreshadowed over hundreds of episodes, creating a fantastic sense of nervous anticipation and dread. Secondly, their believability. All of them feel reasonable in their motivations and actions given their respective backstories, shaping them into a person that feels realistic. Even if to an extreme proportion, they're obviously not evil for the sake of being evil, like you often see in fiction. Thirdly, their direct impacts on other characters. Unlike most arc-based villains, who are usually disattached from our main protagonists, here we have villains intertwined with our main cast. Takasugi, for instance, is drawn back to Gintoki like a moth to a flame. In fact, we see moth imagery surrounding Takasugi all the time, such as those on his clothes and in the openings. Like a moth to a flame, Takasugi's destructive tendencies lead to his own demise. His hatred is his own worst enemy. But anyway, another key factor between the trio is simply that they are deeply complex and interesting, especially in the case of Utsuro and Takasugi, although not to take away from Kamui, who is interesting in his own right, especially in how different he is from the other two. And finally, they are all incredibly concise. They don't show up just for the sake of being there, instead they're used much more sparingly, turning up exclusively to make a meaningful impact within the plot. Ultimately, there doesn't feel like a single wasted or invaluable scene with these characters. And with that being said, we draw to an end. If you want to tell me your own analysis of these fantastic villains, or anything for that matter, then by all means, leave me a comment down below. And with that, I'll be back in the next video. See ya!